Hello, everyone, and welcome to this discussion on tracking allegations of migrant worker abuse and benchmarking company recruitment practices. My name is Rosie Monaghan, and I'm Senior Researcher for KnowTheChain at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. And I'm joined by my colleague Isabel Archer, Senior Researcher for Labour and Migrant Worker Rights at the Resource Centre. Today, we'll be looking at findings from two of our projects here at the Resource Centre relating to unfair recruitment and how companies are responding to risks, as well as remedying abuse when it does occur. Both these projects sit within the Resource Centre's priority programme on the rights of workers in global supply chains. We're going to begin with our analysis of allegations of migrant worker abuse before moving on to examining how companies have responded and their due diligence practices related to recruitment. We'll also be taking you through our set of recommended actions for employers to help mitigate and address these risks in practice beyond making policy commitments. And with that, I'm now going to hand over to Isabel.
Thanks, Rosie, and hello to everyone watching this recording. Jumping straight in to look at what unfair recruitment can actually look like in practice. I think that many of the people watching this will be familiar with many or at least some of these concepts, so we won't go into them in detail. But it is important to start out by emphasising that unfair recruitment can look like a variety of different situations. Workers' experiences are unique, and while sometimes these things can occur alone and independently, often unfair recruitment practices look like several different factors happening simultaneously, which intersect to create situations of increased vulnerability to forced labour, both before employment and when migrant workers arrive in destination countries. Unfair recruitment so often goes to the heart of exploitative working conditions in destination countries because when workers are disadvantaged, when they are laden with debt, disempowered, and don't have access to full and correct information during the recruitment process, this is when situations of wage theft, of overwork, of poor living conditions in destination country are suddenly hugely exacerbated and situations of forced labour much more common. In particular, the charging of illicit or extortionate recruitment fees of thousands of dollars has serious, well-documented and detrimental implications, which make it all the harder for a migrant worker to access safe, decent and fair work. Moving to the next slide, just to underscore that we undertake all of our research, our analysis, and we issue recommendations from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre in line with international standards. And our definition of recruitment fees very much comes from the ILO, which has identified three buckets or three types of recruitment fee charging. The first, straightforward recruitment fees, usually looks like an administrative fee, whereby workers are paying money to an agency for the service of being placed into work. The second, related costs, basically everything that costs money to be able to facilitate that work placement, whether travel, medical insurance, uniform costs, other equipment costs, or admin fees. And the third, illegitimate, unreasonable, and undisclosed costs, basically workers paying over and above what is legally permitted, such as a bribe to immigration officials or to employers themselves. Moving to the next slide. At the Resource Centre, we maintain a database of cases of migrant worker abuse that are alleged to have happened in company operations or in supply chains. And we gather this information from publicly available news sources, from NGO documentation, from government publications and investigations, and sometimes even from companies themselves. And we analyse this data along a set of indicators for labour exploitation, including on unfair recruitment and on recruitment fee charging, which is what we'll look at today. So beginning in January 2022, we have so far tracked a total of 1,260 cases of abuse impacting migrant workers around the world. And in over 1 in 4 of those cases, workers report being charged some kind of fee to obtain work to get their job, either to an agency or to an individual. And the types of fees being cited run the full spectrum of those recruitment fees related costs that we saw in the previous slides. Moving on to the next slide. our data set can really help us answer some key questions about recruitment fee charging risks for migrant workers in the context of wider labour rights abuses that they may be experiencing. And today we'll be looking to answer three main questions, looking at the nationalities who are being charged recruitment fees, where the countries of destination are that workers are heading to, and which sectors, which industries should be most concerned and are most benefiting from the labour of workers who have paid recruitment fees. That first question, so which nationalities are being charged fees? So currently, Nepali, Bangladeshi and Filipino workers are most frequently affected in the cases that we track, which involve workers who are charged fees. And you can see in this graph that compared with our overall data set of labour abuse, shown here in the orange bars, these nationalities are disproportionately likely to have been charged fees compared with how they feature in our overall data set. So while Nepali workers, for example, are impacted in 14% of the cases in our full data set, they are impacted in 21% of cases when we look specifically at those involving recruitment fee charging. On to the second question. As you can see, this is very much an international issue, with workers to destination countries in every major receiving region, including Europe, North America, the Asia Pacific region, and the Gulf region, reporting having paid recruitment fees to get there. And in particular, workers to Qatar, to UK, to Malaysia, and to New Zealand are disproportionately impacted by recruitment fee charging. Globally speaking, the sectors which are most frequently linked to the risk of recruitment fee charging were construction and engineering, agriculture and fishing, and the health and social care sector. Although it's interesting to note that for those last two, these are sectors which employ workers often through seasonal or temporary labour migration programmes, and some of these themselves charge workers for the costs of visas. So employers operating in these particular sectors and benefiting from supply chains should be aware that their workforces are likely to have been exposed to exploitative recruitment fee charging. Moving on to the next slide. I also want to just reiterate what I set out at the start of this presentation, that fee charging is often a precursor to a broad range of labour violations once in destination country. And this slide shows the types of abuses that were most frequently reported by workers who were charged fees. As you can see, really those abuses run a full remit of types of labour exploitation, both in the workplace, so wage theft there being most frequently reported by workers who had been charged fees, but also in terms of workers' living conditions, so precarious and suitable living conditions also being frequently reported. So how are companies responding to allegations of abuse? Well, despite this well-documented evidence base, we really have very little evidence that companies are taking anything more than minimal steps to identify, mitigate, and remedy unfair recruitment regularly or systematically, and certainly not in most of the companies' cases that are contained in the database. We approach companies to invite them to respond publicly to allegations of abuse when we find them linked to their operations or their supply chains. And often, extremely rarely, will companies even confirm they are investigating reports, when really they should be proactively contacting stakeholders, sources, and worker representatives to understand what has happened. Instead, we see pushback from companies in the form of a lack of belief in workers' testimony. So despite it being well documented that workers' testimony is often the only evidence that abuse has occurred, that is not being privileged in investigations. And also, very disappointingly, we often hear from agencies, from temporary migration scheme operators, and from labour suppliers that they were ignorant of what workers had experienced and that it is not their responsibility to detect or remedy fee charging. However, we do have a few cases of better practice in the database that we want to highlight today. And these, in recent months, include a case of a renewable energy company which it disclosed itself that it had uncovered recruitment fee charging happening among supply chain workers in Malaysia. This was remedied. In one particular case, 5 different European and North American hotel brands who investigated fee charging among UAE hotel workers did indeed find that workers had been charged recruitment fees, And in two of those brands, they did reimburse workers. That actually happened within a matter of weeks, so very quickly and very responsively. And another case of garment brands who are currently looking to form buyer groups to investigate and remedy fee charging in factories in a South Asian garment supplying country. So we do know that it is very possible for companies to concretely and materially remedy recruitment fee charging if they are motivated to do so, but we're still a very long way from swift and responsive remedy. So too often migrant workers are going months or even years out of pocket and in debt because companies are not adequately and systematically confronting this reality and monitoring to make sure that workers have not paid recruitment fees. I'm going to hand over now to Rosie to talk about what this can look like in the three sectors that KnowTheChain benchmarks.
Thanks, Isabel. So I'm now going to walk through some of our benchmark findings relevant to recruitment fees at KnowTheChain. So at KnowTheChain, we assess how the largest public companies in three high-risk sectors are addressing forced labour risks in their supply chains based on their publicly available disclosure and on how they respond to allegations of forced labour linked to their supply chains. So our last series of benchmarks, published in 2022 to 2023, assessed 185 companies across the three sectors, which are ICT, food and beverage, and apparel and footwear. We measure responsible recruitment as one of 7 themes of our methodology, which is broadly based on the UNGPs on business and human rights, covering commitment, various forms of due diligence, and remedy. And looking back at our data from the last benchmarks across the three sectors, all 185 companies scored an average of 15 out of 100 for their efforts related to responsible recruitment. And what this measures includes one indicator on recruitment fees and related costs, including company policies, due diligence, and remediation on fees. So more specifically, this assesses whether companies have policies that specify that employers and not workers are responsible for the payment of recruitment fees, the steps they're taking to implement that policy, and whether companies have ensured the repayment of fees to supply chain workers where they have been charged. We also have a second indicator on recruitment where we assess whether companies are taking steps to trace the labour recruiters used by their suppliers, and more broadly, the steps that they're taking to support responsible recruitment in their supply chains, such as training and capacity building for suppliers and recruiters, or engaging with policymakers to improve standards. So looking specifically at our data on recruitment fees, this graph shows the percentage of companies per sector that have a policy on recruitment fees. We make a distinction between policies that simply prohibit fees without specifying who should pay for them instead of workers, which are represented in the grey bars, versus those policies that specify employers are responsible for paying fees as opposed to workers, which is represented in the yellow bar. So we can see some pretty big sectoral differences based on this data. So in the ICT sector, policies prohibiting worker-paid recruitment fees are relatively commonplace, whereas the food and beverage sector is significantly behind, particularly when it comes to policies addressing the employer pays principle. And there are also quite significant sectoral differences when we look at how companies have improved since the previous assessment in 2020. So since our 2020 benchmarks, 12 ICT companies either adopted policies on recruitment-related fees or improved their existing policies, and 10 apparel and footwear companies made the same improvements. But in the food and beverage sector, 3 companies adopted a new recruitment fee policy since 2020. So there does appear to be less momentum or drive for change in that sector when compared with the others, despite the fact that risks to migrant workers are highly prevalent in that sector, as we saw based on the data presented by Isabel. So on this slide, we can see the sectoral differences when it comes to the adoption of the employer pays policy versus the processes and practices companies have implemented in relation to that policy. So there is quite a notable gap between policy and practice in each sector, more noticeable in the ICT sector due to the higher proportion of policies. But the ICT sector also demonstrates the strongest focus on remediation of recruitment fees where the policy has been breached. Overall, though, the percentage of companies disclosing data demonstrating remediation of fees to supply chain workers, represented in the orange bar, is alarmingly low. Where we also see a significant policy versus practice gap is in the steps taken to prevent fees from being charged to workers in the first place, and ensuring that the employer, not the worker, is the one covering the costs of recruitment. So the types of steps that we look for here include mapping labour recruiters used in supply chains, mapping migrant worker journeys and fee amounts charged in different migration corridors, specialised monitoring for fees paid by workers, and examples of how suppliers have implemented the employer pays principle by paying for the costs of recruitment directly, including how that's being verified. However, the average company across all three sectors doesn't disclose how it's ensuring the implementation of employer pays in its supply chains. And while around 12% of companies do disclose taking some of those steps, no company is disclosing comprehensive steps taken to implement this policy across supply chain contexts. We do have some good practice examples to draw from in relation to how companies are preventing the charging of fees to workers in their supply chains. One example comes from the apparel and footwear sector, where a company set out the steps it was taking to eliminate worker-paid fees in Taiwan specifically. This included requiring suppliers to have direct contracts with recruiters, specifying that fees must not be charged to workers, and verifying documents such as personnel files, pay slips, and contracts with labour agencies during visits. To understand recruitment channels, the company disclosed asking suppliers to map all foreign migrant workers in the facility, including sending countries and recruitment channels, interviewing workers, interviewing recruitment agencies in sending and receiving countries, and engaging with the Taiwan Direct Hiring Office. To understand recruitment costs, it reported using Verité's migration corridor fact sheets and researching industry information such as through the IOM. The company further provided concrete examples of how suppliers had worked to prevent fees being charged to workers and to reduce recruitment costs, including a supplier using a direct hiring channel instead of overseas labour agents to reduce 70% of recruitment costs, a supplier using its Vietnam and Thailand facilities to provide local recruitment services and thus reduce reliance on overseas labour agents, and hiring abroad directly in partnership with only a local Taiwanese agent. Another example comes from the electronics sector. One company conducts specialised debt-bonded labour audits in high-risk environments and high-risk labour corridors, and it states that such assessments were conducted in 8 countries in 1 year, demonstrating the scope of this programme across its supply chains. It reported that each audit includes verification of documents from suppliers and labour agents, as well as interviews with labour agencies and workers. The company also reported it has mapped more than 1,100 labour agencies in its supply chains in 32 countries, and as such had an understanding of where recruiters were being used in its supply chains. And finally, our recommendations for companies and employers. In line with migration corridor risks, assume workers have paid fees and commit to reimbursing and repaying. We know based on the allegations data that this is an endemic issue. Carry out specialised interviews with workers at several points throughout the recruitment process as well as after appointment to establish if fees have been paid. Verify whether employers are covering the costs of recruitment. And respond proactively and immediately to allegations of fee charging, and importantly, engage directly with the source of the allegation as well as workers and their representatives. And finally, ensure fees are repaid to workers by their employers, and if necessary, repay directly where suppliers can't do so within a reasonable time frame. Thank you for listening, and on our final slide, you can find a list of our resources on the content we've presented today, as well as more detailed recommendations in the International Migrants Day Global Analysis.